It had been a long day of wrapping gifts and finalizing details for Christmas dinner. I had just moved into this neighborhood a month ago. For details, this happened 10 years ago, 2014 Christmas Eve. I didn't know many of the neighbors. It was a quiet suburb, with neatly lined homes and decorations that sparkled in the fresh snow. Christmas lights blinked softly on porches, and the occasional sound of laughter drifted through the frosty air. That evening, I was home alone. My family would be coming over the next morning, and I was looking forward to a full house and festive cheer. For now, it was just me, a glass of wine, and a quiet night by the fireplace. Around 9 p.m., I decided to take a quick walk outside. The snow was fresh, and the cold air felt crisp and clean. As I made my way around the block, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint at first. Maybe it was the way the streetlights flickered slightly, or how the sound of my boots crunching in the snow seemed louder than usual. Halfway through the walk, I saw someone standing at the far end of the street. At first, I thought it was one of my neighbors, maybe someone taking their dog out or smoking. But the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't moving. They just stood there, facing my direction but too far away to make out any details. Their posture was stiff, unnatural. I shrugged it off and turned back toward my house. It was late, and I had no interest in entertaining weird thoughts. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the figure again. Closer this time. It was unmistakable now. Whoever it was had started following me, their steps slow and deliberate. Trying to act casual, I quickened my pace, my heart beating faster. The distance between us seemed to shrink with every step, even though I didn't hear their boots in the snow. I finally reached my driveway and dashed inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I double-checked all the locks and curtains. I peered out through the peephole. The street was empty. Feeling a little ridiculous, I chalked it up to paranoia. Maybe it was just a neighbor who had no idea how creepy they'd seemed. I settled back into the living room, but the unease lingered. The kind of discomfort that feels like a weight pressing down on your chest. At 11 p.m., there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. I froze, my heart racing. Who would be knocking at this hour on Christmas Eve? Slowly, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. "Hello," I called out hesitantly. No response. The knocking started again, louder this time. I jumped back, gripping my phone tightly. The thought crossed my mind to call the police, but what would I even say? Someone knocked on my door and left? Then I heard it, faint, almost a whisper, the sound of shuffling on my porch. Someone was still out there. I turned off the living room lights, hoping to stay hidden, and grabbed a kitchen knife for protection. Creeping to a window by the side of the house, I peeked out through a sliver in the curtains. My breath caught. There was a man standing just outside the glow of the porch light, dressed in dark clothing. His back was to the house, and he held something long in his hand, maybe a crowbar or a bat. My heart thundered in my chest as I crawled toward my phone and finally dialed the police. Whispering as quietly as I could, I told the dispatcher what was happening. She told me to stay on the line, that officers were on their way. I felt a brief wave of relief until I heard the doorknob rattling. I muffled a gasp and edged closer to the stairs, putting as much distance between myself and the front door as possible. It was then that I remembered the back door, the one I'd forgotten to lock in my rush to get inside. The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity, and as if on cue, I heard the distinct creak of the back door opening. It was the kind of sound you never mistake, the slow whine of old hinges, the groan of wood expanding in the cold. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed the knife, trying to keep my breathing steady. Every sound, the rustle of clothing, the shuffle of cautious footsteps, was amplified in the silence. My mind raced, imagining what this person wanted, whether they'd leave if they couldn't find me or if they were prepared to hurt me. I crouched in the darkness under the staircase, clutching the knife like it was the only thing anchoring me to this reality. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, slow and steady, deliberate and searching. The kitchen drawer opened, then another. He was going through my stuff. From where I hid, I caught a brief glimpse of him as he moved closer to the living room. He was tall, wearing a ski mask. His eyes darted around the room, cold and methodical. He carried something in his hand. Definitely a crowbar. I heard the faintest wail of a siren in the distance. The police were coming, but would they get here in time? My fingers trembled as I tightened my grip on the knife. Should I wait and hope he didn't find me, or make a run for it? As the footsteps closed in, my phone buzzed quietly in my pocket, one of those emergency alerts that couldn't be silenced. His head snapped toward the staircase. It was the longest 10 seconds of my life. His breathing grew louder as he stepped closer. I felt trapped, pinned by the crushing weight of fear. Just as his shadow loomed over the space where I hid, the front door burst open. "Police! Drop the weapon!" The shout was sharp and authoritative, breaking the suffocating silence. The man bolted toward the back of the house. I didn't see what happened next, just the chaos of shouting, the stomping of boots, and the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. It was over. When the officer finally escorted me out, I saw them leading the man away in handcuffs. One of them told me I was lucky. That they'd been patrolling nearby when the call came in? Or this could have ended much worse. They didn't need to tell me twice. I already knew. I spent the rest of the night staring at my broken back door. The image of his cold eyes burned into my memory. Christmas morning came, but it wasn't filled with joy or warmth. Just the cold realization of how close I came to not seeing another one. Christmas Eve in my family cabin should have been peaceful. It wasn't my first time there, but being alone hit differently this time. The place carried so many memories, especially of my grandparents, who'd spent every holiday here. The drive through the snowy woods was slow, the storm was picking up. The cabin's familiar outline came into view, smaller than I remembered, but just as welcoming. Except, somehow, this time it felt off. The frost on the windows made the place seem cloaked in silence. Once inside, I turned on the old wall heater and unpacked quickly, trying not to let the cold creep into my bones. Everything looked untouched, frozen in time. The same scratch on the wooden dining table, the little cross-stitch Merry Christmas framed near the fireplace. It was as if they'd left yesterday. The first few hours were fine. I lit a fire, boiled some water for tea, and put on an audiobook. The crackling flames were comforting, even as the storm howled outside, battering the windows with snow. I was settling into the couch when I noticed something small. The kitchen door that I'd closed earlier was slightly ajar. Not open all the way, just enough for a sliver of dark woods to be visible. I froze, my cup halfway to my lips. I must have forgotten to shut it properly. That was my first thought. Logic, right? So I walked over, peeking outside briefly. Snow had piled on the back porch, untouched. No footprints, no sign of movement. I shut the door firmly this time, bolting it just in case. The fire was dying down, so I got up to stoke it. It was then I noticed my first red flag. There was a boot print on the hardwood floor near the entryway. Just one. Clear as day, damp with melted snow. It wasn't mine. I stared at it, frozen. My boots were still by the door, completely dry. A million thoughts ran through my head, all of them bad. Did someone follow me in here? Was someone hiding? I convinced myself it was old. A mark I just hadn't noticed when I came in. Grabbing the fireplace poker, I walked through every room, my heart racing. The small cabin didn't offer many hiding places. The closets were empty. The guest bedroom hadn't been touched. The attic was locked, and I knew the key was in my pocket. Nothing seemed out of place except for that boot print. Still uneasy, I returned to the living room, trying to push away the creeping paranoia. The storm was relentless now, wind screaming through the trees. I told myself to calm down. Maybe I was overreacting, seeing things because I was alone. Then came the sound. Not tapping, not some cliché. It was a distinct creak, heavy and slow, like the sound an old floorboard makes when someone steps on it. My stomach dropped. It was upstairs. But here's the thing. The cabin didn't have a second floor, at least not anymore. It had been closed off when my grandparents downsized the space years ago. The access had been sealed shut, just beams and insulation above the living area now. I stared at the ceiling, my breath coming in short gasps. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The creak came again, more deliberate this time. I wanted to believe it was the storm, or maybe an animal on the roof, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever was making that sound was inside the cabin. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and tried calling for help. No signal. Of course. I cursed under my breath, clutching the poker tighter. "Hello?" I called out, hating the way my voice sounded, small and shaky. No response. I forced myself to approach the corner of the room where the ceiling hatch used to be. The ladder had long been removed, but you could still see the faint outline of where the entry had been. I listened, barely breathing. Nothing. Then, so faintly, I almost doubted myself. A low exhale. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run. But where would I go? The snowstorm was brutal, and the nearest house was miles away. Staying inside felt like the safer option, but that logic began to crumble with every passing second. I gathered my things quickly, my adrenaline spiking. If I made a dash for my car, I could leave. But as I swung my bag over my shoulder, I heard it again. A step. This time closer. I snapped. "I know you're in here," I shouted, voice trembling but loud. "I'm armed. Get out now, and I won't call the cops." The silence that followed was almost worse than a reply. Then came the loud thud. Something fell or was dropped behind me. I spun around, poker raised, ready to swing. The shadow I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a clear figure, just something large and human-like slipping out of sight into the hallway. My entire body felt frozen, but my mind was screaming, "Run!" I bolted for the front door, flinging it open to be met with a wall of wind and snow. My boots barely found traction on the icy steps as I stumbled to my car. I slammed into the side, fumbling with my keys, heart pounding as if it might explode. Once inside, I locked the doors, hands shaking as I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered to life. Relief washed over me for a split second, until I glanced back at the cabin. There in the window was the faint outline of a face. Pale, watching. I slammed the gas, tires spinning on the icy driveway before catching and propelling me forward. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. Now sitting at home, replaying that night, I keep asking myself the same questions. Who or what was in that cabin? How long had they been there before I arrived, and why didn't they follow me when I left? One thing's for sure, I'm never going back. Not on Christmas Eve, not ever. It was Christmas Eve, 2020, just outside of Kansas City, Missouri. I was driving back from my cousin's house late at night after an argument over something trivial. I can still remember how the cold, damp air felt against my skin as I sped down the dark, winding road, the headlights cutting through the blanket of darkness. I told myself it was the loneliness of the night getting to me, the anxiety I hadn't been able to shake since that row earlier. The car radio was set to some light Christmas music, but the serene tunes did nothing to calm my frazzled nerves. The roads were empty, and as usual, it seemed like no one else had places to be on Christmas Eve. That's when I saw the flash of taillights ahead. It was a beat-up van, slow-moving, right at the edge of the lane. For a moment, I thought it might just be someone tired, driving back after a long day of travel. But something about the way the van was swerving, it wasn't just a sleepy driver. They were slowing down dramatically, to the point that they were nearly at a standstill in the middle of the road. I wasn't sure what to do. It's Christmas Eve. No one would be out here at this hour, at least not without a good reason. And the oddity of it, no other cars for miles, no streetlights, nothing but this random van in the dead of night, made me hesitate. Should I honk? Should I stop? And why did I feel this crawling unease? The hair standing on the back of my neck. Eventually, I decided to pull up to the van. As I got closer, the brake lights flicked off, but the van didn't start moving again. My heart rate picked up. The only sound in the air was the thud of my pulse. My options were clear. Keep driving and hope everything's fine, or stop and check. I decided that what little sense I had left told me to at least stop and ask if the driver needed help. I couldn't just drive by like nothing was wrong. Too many years of reading horror stories, movies, and even the nagging fears that always stick in the back of your mind. So I stopped, rolled the window down, and before I could say anything, I heard the sound of the door latch opening. A man stepped out from the shadows, wearing a faded plaid shirt and a weathered baseball cap. He seemed normal enough, but in the dim glow of my headlights, there was an odd tension to his stance that made me second-guess every impulse to be kind. "You all right?" I asked, hoping the words wouldn't come out as frantic as they felt. The man gave a soft, almost shaky chuckle. "Yeah, just a little lost, I suppose. Trying to get to a friend's house down the road, but my truck broke down, and it's too damn cold to keep waiting." Something about his tone didn't sit right. He wasn't making direct eye contact. Instead, he was looking past me, like he wasn't fully interested in my help. At that moment, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Another figure, just off to the side, hidden behind the shadow of the van. I didn't see their face, only a vague silhouette standing still. My breath caught. How many people were in this van? And where was that other person hiding? Suddenly, my senses were on high alert. I knew I had to make a decision. The tension in the air was palpable. My instincts were shouting at me. Something was off. Without really thinking, I gave a half nod and muttered something about calling for help on my phone. I couldn't quite form the words, but the man didn't seem to mind. He stood there silently, and it wasn't until I turned to make a half-hearted attempt at getting my phone out of my pocket that he shifted closer. That was when I saw his eyes fully for the first time. Narrow, dull eyes. No life in them at all. He was no longer playing the role of a stranded traveler in need of help. He was something else, something unpredictable. "I don't think you'll need to do that," he said in a voice that made me tense. His words were slow, deliberate. He took another step forward, slowly, almost casually, as though he was sizing me up, seeing whether I'd make the first move. I knew this was bad. That feeling in my gut, the one that had been with me all night, had been right. I acted on reflex, jumping back into the car. The engine was already running, and I didn't wait another second before slamming it into drive. My tires screeched as I forced the car back onto the road and sped away. I didn't glance back. In my rear view, all I saw were two figures standing by the side of the road, watching me leave. I didn't feel safe again until I had made it a few miles down the road, when I saw a lit gas station in the distance. But that's when the doubt began to creep in. Why hadn't they followed me? Was there a plan? A setup? If I had waited one moment longer, what was in that van? My hands were shaking when I finally pulled over at the gas station. I didn't stop to refuel. I didn't need gas. I just needed to take a breath, check to see if I was still the same person, if I'd survived this. At that moment, as I stepped out of the car to fill my cup with warm coffee, I caught sight of someone standing off to the side of the station. The same man. I could barely recognize him at first, but it was him. His pale face, his eyes meeting mine, cold as stone. I quickly pulled myself back into the car, locking the doors and pushing the gear shift into drive. My hands trembled harder than before, and as I drove off into the rest of the night, I kept my eyes peeled for any van in the distance. None showed up. I never saw that man again after that night. But every time I see a van on the side of a quiet road, I can't help but wonder if I would have done anything differently. Whether my chance to do something heroic was all just a few seconds too late. Christmas Eve wasn't what I expected, but I'll never forget it.